The desert did not care who you were. It baked everything the same metal, stone, pride, down to the same colorless heat. At 0630, the temperature at forward operating base Kestrel was already 91 degrees, and the sky over the Mojave held the flat white color of old bone. Sergeant First Class Emily Carter stepped off the transport vehicle and did not look around. She set her kit bag on the ground, adjusted the strap of her rifle case. Then she looked at the base the way she looked at everything quietly, from still eyes, cataloging without comment. FOB Kestrel was a serious place. Permanent structures, not tents. Hardened walls, camera arrays, a firing range that extended nearly 1,000 meters into scrubland. The kind of base where careers were made or buried, where the men who staffed it had done real things in real places and carried that history in the way they moved. There were 14 of them watching her now. She counted without turning her head. 2 near the motor pool, 4 on the steps of the main ops building, 3 more by the water station, pretending to fill canteens. The others scattered, leaning on posts, standing in doorways the way men stand when they want to appear as though they aren't watching something. They were all watching. She had been briefed on this unit. 1st Marine Raider Battalion, augmented, Tier 1 selection washouts, who'd found their way here through one transfer or another. Staff Sergeant Daniel Kruger was the one leaning against the flagpole with his arms crossed, the one the briefing document had called unit's most decorated long-range marksman, 23 confirmed. Mid-30s, jaw like a geological formation, a kind of contempt that had been so thoroughly practiced it had become his resting expression. He was looking at her the way people look at a car that is parked in the wrong spot. The base commander, Major Harold Voss, came down the steps of the ops building with a clipboard under his arm. He was a short man, thick through the chest, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had been weathered into something harder and more permanent. He walked with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned a long time ago that pace communicates authority and that the right pace communicates it without requiring you to announce it. He stopped in front of her and did not extend a hand. Carter, not a greeting, a confirmation. Sir, you're the evaluation candidate. Yes, sir. He looked her over once, the way a contractor looks at a renovation project, assessing cost, assessing timeline, looking for the problem that will surface 2 weeks in. He did not find what he was looking for, or perhaps he found something else. His expression gave nothing away, which was itself a form of information. 5'6", he said, 140 pounds. 138, sir. Something moved across his face too quick to read. He nodded toward the range, briefing it 0800. Kruger will orient you. He went back inside without ceremony, the screen door swinging shut behind him with a flat aluminum sound. Kruger pushed off the flagpole and walked toward her with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned every room he walked into. In the open desert, with no room to own, he had adapted. He owned the ground. The 30 feet between the flagpole and where she stood, he crossed as if he had already decided the outcome of crossing it. He stopped at a distance that was slightly too close, not threatening, just enough to communicate that he controlled the geometry of the space. So, he looked at the rifle case. They're sending us a trial run. She said nothing. Where'd you qualify? Benning? No. Bragg? She picked up her kit bag. Hey. His voice carried just enough volume for the men nearby to hear. I asked you a question. I heard you. Kruger smiled. It was the smile of a man who was very comfortable with what was about to happen. He turned his head slightly, a theater gesture, performing for an audience he knew was there. Boys, he said, looks like command sent us a babysitter. A few laughs. The easy kind, reflexive, the way smoke rises. Range evaluation is at 1,400, he said, turning back to her. 800 meters. Standard qualification targets. He paused, letting the next words land with deliberate weight. I'll be watching. He started to walk away, then stopped, half-turned, the smile still in place. Try not to miss too wide, sweetheart. The targets don't move out here. We keep it simple for new arrivals. More laughter. The kind that trails off slowly, wanting to be heard. Emily Carter adjusted the strap of her rifle case and walked toward the barracks. She did not look back. The range at 1,400 was standing room. Word had traveled the way it always does in closed environments, fast and dressed up. By the time Emily arrived, there were 31 people gathered in various states of nonchalance, sitting on supply crates, standing along the viewing berm. A few had brought water bottles with the seriousness of spectators at an event. Kruger was already there, arms crossed, his rifle slung across his back like punctuation. Emily set her case down at the designated firing position. She opened it methodically, Not slowly, methodically. There is a difference. Slow performance announces itself. Methodical is just a person doing what they have always done. The rifle was a Accuracy International AXMC in 338 Lapua Magnum. Modified stock, custom barrel, a Schmidt and Bender scope that she had reservoed 3 times at 3 different elevations. It was not a factory build. It had been modified over 7 years in ways that were not visible and not explained. Corporal Stephen Mack, the range officer, read the conditions aloud. Wind is 12 knots, southwest, variable. Targets at 800, 900, 1,000, 900, and 800 meters respectively. Sequential engagement. 60-second standard interval between shots. 800 meters. 900. 1,000. Someone in the crowd said something low. There was a response. More laughter. Emily lay down behind the rifle. She did not perform the process of settling in. She was simply not there, and then she was. Prone, left hand under the forend, right elbow anchored, cheek on the stock in the same place it had found 1,000 times before. The position was not something she assembled. It was something she returned to, the way you return to a chair that has shaped itself to you over years. She looked through the scope. The magnification brought the first target to her, a standard E-type silhouette, steel plate, 800 meters in the flat desert heat. Through 20x magnification, the air between her and the target was visible as a physical thing, shimmering in thermal waves that bent light and therefore bent the path of bullets if you gave them the respect they asked for. She did not give them that respect. She gave them instead what they actually required. A precise accounting of their behavior, filed and acted upon, not feared. Mirage was active. The air shimmered in waves that would pull a bullet's path off-center if you tracked them wrong, if you gave them the respect they asked for. She did not track them. She read the interval, found the stable moment between pulses, and held. A gust came from the southwest. She felt it against the left side of her neck, registered the degree of deflection it would produce at this distance, applied the correction. Not consciously, the calculation happened below language, in the part of the brain that has been trained past thought into reflex. She exhaled. The shot broke. The steel plate at 800 meters rang a flat, decisive sound that carried back across the desert with no echo, just arrival. A sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Silence behind her. She worked the bolt. The brass ejected cleanly. She moved to the second target, 900 meters. The wind had increased in the last 30 seconds. She felt it change against the left side of her neck, the way a doctor takes a pulse, reading for information, not for comfort. She applied the correction before the scope had fully settled. Second shot. The 900 meter plate rang. The silence behind her was now a different kind of silence. The laughing kind had gone. This was the listening kind, the silence of 30 people recalibrating. Third target. 1,000 meters. The mirage at this distance was significant. The air over the desert at 1,400 hours in summer was moving in layers, each layer with its own velocity and direction, and they compounded the way interference patterns compound, not simply. Most shooters waited it out. Waited for a moment of stillness between gusts when conditions temporarily aligned. It was the sensible approach. It was also slow, and it assumed that stillness would eventually arrive. Emily did not wait. She read the layers the way a navigator reads a current, not for calm, but for the exact shape of the disturbance, and she put the shot through the gap that existed in the turbulence, with the precision of a surgeon passing a needle between ribs. The plate at 1,000 meters rang. Someone behind her made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind that exits a person involuntarily, before their composure has a chance to intervene. Fourth target. Back to 900, slight shift left. She had been watching a dust devil forming off the right edge of the range for the last 3 minutes, a column of spinning air no more than 2 feet in diameter. But at 900 meters, enough to deflect a 338 Lapua projectile, 2 to 3 inches offline. It would cross the firing lane in approximately 40 seconds. She shot before it arrived, not rush-timed. There is a difference. Ring. Fifth target, 800 meters, right edge of the original starting lane. She was 5 shots into a string, and her pulse had not risen by a measurable degree. The stock was still. The air was still, or at least still enough, and she found the trigger with the same familiar pressure, the same practiced absence of decision, just the completion of a thing already set in motion. The way the last domino falls, not because it is pushed, but because all the others have already fallen. The fifth plate rang. She worked the bolt, set the safety, lay still for 2 seconds long enough to confirm, short enough not to perform. Then she rose, cleared the weapon, and began disassembling the rifle. She did not look at the crowd. 31 people stood behind the berm in total silence. Kruger had not moved. His arms were still crossed. But the expression was different now. Not contempt, not anger. Something harder to name. The look of a man whose internal map of the world has just been revised and who has not decided how he feels about the new geography. Corporal Max spoke first. He said, 5 for 5. 1000. Meter third shot confirmed. No one responded. Emily closed her rifle case. She picked it up and walked back toward the barracks. Not one person said anything. By evening, the story had taken on the properties of a stone thrown in water. In the first telling, she'd had favorable winds. In the second, the targets were non-standard, easier than usual. By the third, someone suggested the scope had been pre-calibrated by a technician, that she hadn't done the math herself. The human mind does extraordinary work when a belief requires protecting. Emily heard none of this directly. She heard it the way you hear things on a base in half-conversations that stop when you enter, in the careful silences of men who are not quite finished discussing something. She filed it and continued. Major Voss was not a stupid man. He called her into his office at 1800, the light coming through the Venetian blinds in horizontal bars across his desk. He looked at the evaluation sheet in front of him without picking it up. Impressive result this afternoon. Thank you, sir. Kruger has been the best long-range shooter this unit has seen in 4 years. She waited. He's not pleased. I understand. Voss looked up. Do you? Not a question. She met his eyes and said nothing. He set the evaluation sheet down. Your file has some gaps. Yes, sir. 2 years that aren't accounted for. Between your last deployment and this assignment. Yes, sir. I could ask about that. You could, sir. He studied her for a moment. Whatever he was looking for, he either found it or decided not to look further. Evaluation passes. You're on the roster. But understand something, Carter. This unit functions on trust and integration. Those aren't easy things to build with a performance that draws attention. I understand. Good. Dismissed. She left his office and walked down the exterior corridor in the last light of the day, the desert going gold and then copper around the base's perimeter. Private First Class Wayne Donaldson fell into step beside her, not accidentally. He was 22, recently rotated in, with the eager, slightly anxious energy of someone who has not yet figured out which version of himself to be in this environment. That was something today, he said. She kept walking. I mean, I've been here 8 months. I've seen Kruger shoot. He's good. Like, genuinely good. But what you did, he shook his head. People are saying you cheated. I know. That's not, I don't believe that. She glanced at him sidelong, briefly. Okay. Do you want me to say something? To some of the guys? She stopped walking and looked at him directly. He was trying to help, genuinely, in the way of someone who has not yet learned that some bridges must be built from one side only, and that telling someone else to walk across them on your behalf is not the same thing as crossing. No, she said. Not unkindly. She went inside. In the days that followed, she was quiet in a way that was not the same as absent. She observed everything. She noticed that Kruger's locker was in the third bay from the entrance, and that he organized his equipment with the exact precision of someone who had been told once that organization is professionalism and had taken that lesson to its logical extreme. She noticed that the communications sergeant, a thin-faced man named Curtis Bellamy, ate lunch alone every day at the table nearest the door, not the window, and that he checked his personal phone more often than the operational schedule warranted. She noticed the feed wires on the southern camera array ran slightly loose at the junction box, a maintenance issue probably. She filed it. She filed everything. The briefing was called at 0500 on a Thursday in a room that smelled of coffee and something else, the particular institutional tension of people being told things they don't want to hear. 9 operators, Voss at the front. The intelligence officer, Captain Renee Ashworth, at the projector. She was 35 and had the self-possessed competence of someone who had spent years being the only person in the room who had actually read the document everyone else was discussing. The map on the screen showed a sector of the Sonora Desert, cross-border, classified. Ridgeline positions marked in red. A compound at coordinates that had been photographed by 3 different systems over the past 72 hours. Operation Clean Slate, Ashworth said. Objective: elimination of a coordination node responsible for routing material to 2 separate threat networks. The compound is staffed by a rotating security detail, estimated 12 to 14 personnel, with a primary coordinator identified as the target. She clicked to the next slide. 4 previous attempts by Special Operations assets to approach this position have failed. 3 of those 4 resulted in casualties or missing personnel. The terrain offers limited cover approaching from any viable vector. The compound is on a natural elevation with sightlines extending approximately 800 meters in each direction. She paused. Analysis suggests the failures are not attributable to tactical deficiency on the part of the previous teams. The room was quiet in a particular way. Something is feeding them movement information ahead of engagement. We don't know what. We don't know from where. Voss took over. Given that analysis, Command has determined that a single operator long-range engagement is preferable to a team insertion. Smaller signature, less predictability, higher likelihood of maintaining approach security. He looked around the room. This is a voluntary assignment. I won't order it. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a broad-shouldered, meticulous man who had twice been recommended for Medal of Honor consideration and twice declined to submit paperwork, said, "I'll go." "You're not qualified for the distance requirements on this one, Marcus." Another silence. Emily said, "I'll go." No one turned to look at her. They were all already looking at her. Kruger said, "That's not your call." "Voluntary assignment," she said. Those were the words. Voss studied his clipboard. Carter's evaluation scores exceed threshold requirements. "She's been here a week," Kruger said. "The scores are what they are. She doesn't know this unit. She doesn't know how we operate. She doesn't know the terrain, the conditions." "I'll go alone," Emily said. The room had the quality of a photograph. Everything stopped, held. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the map. Single operator, vehicle insertion to the 3-kilometer point. On foot from there. He paused. "Carter." "Sir." "You have 48 hours to study the terrain package. I need 12. Webb looked at her. Not with hostility, with the particular attention of someone revising a previous assessment. Kruger said nothing. He stared at the map with the expression of a man who suspects he is watching something important happen but cannot decide if he should prevent it or step aside. The 12 hours before departure she spent alone with the terrain package, a topographic map, 3 satellite imagery sets, and her own memory. The memory was the oldest resource. She had been in this kind of terrain before, not this exact location, but the particular grammar of high desert, the way ridgelines compress distance visually while extending it physically, the way the light in late afternoon creates shadow gradients that can be read like a map of their own if you have spent enough time learning their language. She had spent enough time. There had been a mission in 2019 redacted from most files, present in all the ones that mattered, in which Emily Carter had held a position for 19 hours, in conditions that intelligence had described as acceptable, and which had been, in practice, a systematic series of failures, each one compounding the last. Her spotter, Corporal David Renner, had been 26 years old, and had a photograph of his daughter taped inside his kit cover, the edges soft from handling. He had been methodical and steady, and the kind of person who makes a difficult task feel less difficult simply by being next to you, not because he removed the difficulty, but because he absorbed some of it, spread it across 2 people instead of 1. He had believed in doing things correctly. He had believed that doing things correctly was sufficient protection against things going wrong. He had been right about the first part. He had been wrong about the second part. He was dead. She had carried him out. 19 hours in, under fire, across 2 kilometers of terrain that the mission plan had categorized as moderate difficulty approach, which was accurate in isolation and catastrophically wrong in context, because the difficulty was not the terrain itself, but the fact that armed personnel were waiting at 3 of the 4 viable egress points, as if they had been told exactly where to stand. And the mission report had attributed the failure to advance intelligence compromise attributable to ground team operations language that translated, under the bureaucratic gloss, to, "It was her fault." The team had been compromised. The team was Carter and Renner. Renner was dead. The math of attribution in institutional settings is not complicated. She had written her own account, 13 pages, precise, dated, with attached documentation of the timeline anomalies that proved the defender positions could not have been established in response to the team's movement, because the positions had been established before the team's movement had begun. She had submitted it through 3 channels. The report had been received, acknowledged, and filed. Nothing had happened. She had left the system. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no burned bridge, no statement. She had completed her current assignment, declined re-enlistment, and walked away from the gate of the last base she served at with the same kit bag and the same rifle case she carried now, and without looking back. She had been right about the facts and wrong about what the facts would accomplish. That is a specific kind of defeat, not the defeat of being incorrect, but the defeat of being correct in a place that has decided correctness is not relevant. It takes a long time to come back from that particular shape of loss. She had come back now because the intelligence package on Operation Clean Slate had contained one detail that was not present in any other briefing document, a detail that connected this compound, this coordinator, to the same network that had been operating in 2019, the same methodological signature, the same impossible foreknowledge of insertion routes, the same precision of pre-positioned defenders that should not have been possible without inside information. She was not here to avenge anything. Vengeance requires that the outcome be for you. What she needed was for the outcome to be accurate, for the record to be corrected, for the living to understand what had actually happened, and for whatever operational network had been running uninterrupted since 2019 to be closed. Renner's daughter was 11 years old and would someday want to know why her father had died. She deserved an answer that was true. That was the entire reason. She memorized the terrain. She slept 3 hours. She left before dawn. The vehicle took her to the 3-kilometer mark and left without ceremony. She stood in the pre-dawn dark and listened. The desert in the dark is not silent. It has a textured silence made of wind and small animal movement and the distant percussion of things settling in temperature change. A lizard somewhere to her left. Wind from the northwest, 8 to 10 knots, carrying ho. Harrying the faint mineral smell of the salt flat 3 miles north. Nothing that was not supposed to be there. She listened to it for 90 seconds, parsing for anomaly, finding none. She started walking. She moved in the way she had learned to move in terrain like this, not slowly, but with a quality of movement that minimized visual signature, that never presented a silhouette against a ridgeline, that placed each step in a surface selected 2 steps in advance. It is a form of sustained attention that looks, from the outside, like ordinary walking. From the inside, it is closer to a continuous calculation, ground composition, angle of approach, the relationship between her position and the nearest elevated terrain, the location of shadows cast by the pre-dawn starlight that were dense enough to absorb her outline and those that were not. Her kit was configured for minimum profile. 40 pounds total, distributed correctly, water for 36 hours, ammunition, a secondary communication unit on a separate frequency from the Kestrel standard encryption, not because she didn't trust the primary, but because she never trusted any single system with anything that mattered. Medical kit, the camera she had added at the last moment, tucking it into the left chest pocket of her pack, a decision she could not fully articulate at the time, and which she would later understand had been the product of a suspicion she had not yet consciously formed, but which her brain had already begun to develop from the raw material of what she had observed. By the time dawn broke, she was past the 2-kilometer mark and in position above a wadi, a dry streambed that the satellite imagery had shown as a natural covered approach to the ridgeline above the compound. She stopped. Something was wrong. She had been taught to name the sensation, not to dismiss it as nerves, not to override it with logic, but to sit with it until it became information. She had been taught this by a woman she had trained under at Fort Bragg, whose name appeared in no publicly available document, and who had once told her that the feeling of wrongness is not a feeling. It is a computation your brain has completed faster than your verbal processing can keep pace with, and the only failure mode is treating it as emotion rather than data. She sat with it. The desert to her left was different from the desert in the satellite images. The track of a tire, weeks old but present, where the imagery had shown undisturbed ground, faint, partially obscured by wind-blown sand, present. A bootprint near the wadi wall, pointing outward away from the compound, not toward it as if someone had recently departed this position after waiting in it for a period of time sufficient to leave a heel impression in the compacted sand. She processed this. Someone had been here. Someone connected to the compound or connected to something monitoring the approach. The position had been scouted. The route she was on had been anticipated. Not today, the prints were too old for today, but anticipated in advance, as a probable approach, as a lane worth watching. She changed routes. She moved upslope, away from the wadi, into terrain that was harder, more exposed in terms of ground surface, rockier, louder underfoot, but which had not appeared in any standard approach calculation because no rational tactical mind would choose it. The rock faces were at 40 degrees in places, unplanted, requiring full contact climbing for 40 meters. Her left hand found purchase, and she climbed with the methodical patience of someone who has done this before and knows that speed is the enemy of continuity on rock, and that continuity is the only thing that gets you to the top. She climbed. The sun was fully up by the time she reached the secondary ridgeline. She was sweating through her shirt, and her hands had 2 small cuts from the rock face she would find, the one on her left forearm later, a rock fragment that had opened the skin without her noticing, the adrenaline of the climb having attended to other priorities. She lay prone behind a boulder the size of a small car, reduced her breathing to a controlled minimum, and began watching the compound below. It was 300 meters below and 600 meters lateral to her position. She had a clear sightline to approximately 70% of the compound's visible area. The remaining 30% was obscured by the main structure's roof overhang and a secondary wall, which was acceptable. She needed to see the key positions, not all positions. 12 personnel. She counted them over 40 minutes, tracking movement patterns, noting rest cycles, identifying the 3 who moved with the particular purposefulness of men with designated roles rather than general security duty. The coordinator, she had a photograph, mid-50s, civilian dress over a military bearing. The kind of man who is not fully committed to either identity appeared twice in the doorway of the main structure, once at 0847, once at 0919. Exactly 72 minutes between appearances. Pattern established. She set up the rifle, and then she found the signal. It was not obvious. It would not have been obvious to anyone who had not spent 5 years thinking about how a network maintained awareness of things it had no right to know. The evidence was in behavior, not in equipment, in the way one of the security personnel, a man she designated Tangent 3, moved to the north wall of the compound at intervals that correlated precisely with the timing windows of the previous failed approach attempts, based on the mission timelines in her briefing package. Not approximately, precisely. He was receiving information on a schedule, and the schedule matched the exfil windows that FOB Kestrel used for classified operational communications. She thought about Curtis Bellamy eating alone at the table nearest the door, the personal phone. The way he had been present in the ops building during each of the previous mission briefings and absent, she checked her memory, reviewed the seating chart from her observation during the 2 non-operational briefings that week. She thought about the loose feed wire on the southern camera array, a maintenance issue, probably, or a modification, something that created an intermittent gap in surveillance coverage during the precise window when a person inside the base might wish to make a communication that did not appear in any log. She did not have proof. Not the kind that could be demonstrated to a review board, supported with documents, argued in a formal proceeding. She had something more functional than that. She had a clear understanding of exactly how this had worked in 2019, and of exactly how it was working now, and of the specific chain of events that would unfold in the next 4 to 6 hours when she failed to transmit a scheduled check-in and the base attempted to locate her position. If she was right, Tangent 3 would receive that location. She calculated options. She had 3. Option 1. Abort, return to the base, present her analysis, risk, insufficient evidence to compel action, potential compromise of her findings to the source, before any investigation could be mounted. Option 2. Transmit a false check-in with false position data and observe the response. Risk, complex, potentially detectable, dependent on the source accepting false information. Option 3. Complete the mission objective before her position could be betrayed, then return with evidence collected here. Tangent 3's movement patterns, the timing correlations, and present it alongside the physical evidence she had begun to assemble in her mind's reconstruction of what the camera array modification would look like up close. She chose option 3. She began making calculations. The wind at this elevation changed at 40-minute intervals. She had been watching it since arrival, building a model, not of what it was doing now, but of what it would do. The behavior of wind in complex terrain is a system with memory, and if you have observed enough of its history, you can anticipate its next state with a precision that looks, to outside observers, like something other than analysis. It is analysis. It is simply very fast, very practiced analysis. She had 5 designated targets. Target 1 was the communications hub, a portable unit on the compound's north face, responsible for the coordination network. At 1134, there was a 2-second window between wind gusts when the range conditions across the valley would be stable enough for a 1,100-meter shot. She had calculated this window 7 minutes in advance. She waited. The window came. The shot broke. The communications unit disintegrated. Target 2 was the compound's generator backup power, which controlled the remote detonation systems on the access road that had destroyed 2 of the previous team's vehicles. 840 meters, slight right drift, crosswind shifting east. She fired in the gap between the first and second phases of the wind cycle. The generator ceased to function. A shout from inside the compound. Movement. The security personnel were trained. They had dropped into cover positions within 4 seconds of the first shot. but their cover positions had been designed for threats approaching from the standard approach vectors, the Wadi, the South Road, the ridge directly east, not from above north, not from the position no rational tactical mind would choose. Target 3 was Tangent 3 himself, the receptor in the network, the node that had received the information from inside the base. She tracked him as he moved between cover positions, watched the irregular pattern of his movement that distinguished it from the disciplined response of the genuine security personnel, and waited for him to cross the open ground between the storage structure and the east wall. He crossed it. She led him by the calculation her hands had already made before her mind had finished the sentence. Third shot. Tangent 3 did not reach the east wall. Targets 4 and 5 were the coordinator and the individual she had identified as logistics, the operational and supply nodes of the network, the two elements whose removal would not merely disrupt but genuinely collapse the structure that had been functioning, uninterrupted, since at least 2019. Target 4 required patience. The coordinator had not emerged from the main structure since the shooting began. She waited. Not because she was certain he would emerge, she was not certain, but because she understood that a man who has spent years in a network sustained by intelligence advantage will, when that advantage is suddenly removed, attempt to restore it. He would need to communicate. To do that, he would need to reach equipment that was no longer in the communications hub. He emerged at 1,218, moving toward the secondary unit on the east face. She shot him at 40 meters from his objective. Target 5 Logistics made the decision to run at 1,219, moving toward the vehicle access on the south perimeter. She tracked him across 300 meters of open desert, leading precisely for his pace and vector, and ended the movement at 1,221. Silence. She lay behind the rifle for 4 minutes, watching, counting, confirming. Then she began the process of extracting. She was bleeding from her left forearm where a rock fragment had opened the skin during her approach. She had not noticed it at the time, and noticed it now with a kind of detached administrative awareness. She wrapped it with the tape she kept in her left breast pocket, secured the dressing, picked up the rifle, and began walking north. She had 9 kilometers to the pickup point. She walked them. She was back at FOB Kestrel at 0330. She had not transmitted ahead of schedule. She arrived at the main gate with dust in every crease of her uniform, and blood darkened brown on the tape around her left arm, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent long hours doing difficult things, and have arrived on the other side of those things, intact. The duty officer, Lieutenant Greg Paulson, looked at her for a moment across the gate checkpoint with the expression of someone who has not yet adjusted his understanding to include what he is currently seeing. Carter, I need to see Major Voss. It's kolmesata kolmekumente. Yes. He woke Voss. She laid out the evidence in the room with the Venetian blinds, which at 0400 were letting in no light at all. Topographic notes, timing correlations, the behavior documentation of Tangent 3, the camera array modification she had photographed it on departure, looping back to the southern perimeter of Kestrel on a route that added 40 minutes and required her to cross terrain she had not previously scouted, because confirmation was worth 40 minutes. She laid the photographs on the desk. Voss looked at them. Then he looked at her. Then he picked up his phone. Captain Renee Ashworth arrived in 11 minutes, fully dressed, with the counterintelligence file that had apparently been sitting in her system for 6 weeks waiting for exactly this kind of corroboration. Bellamy, Ashworth said, looking at the timing correlation chart. Not a question. That would be my assessment, Emily said. Communications Sergeant Curtis Bellamy was placed in temporary custody at 0512, before morning formation. In the quiet way that these things are done when the situation is serious and the leadership is competent. There was no drama. There was no confrontation in the corridor. There was a pair of officers knocking on a door, and then a man being led away, and then silence. The 2019 file was reopened by the end of the week. The finding, when it was amended, would clear Emily Carter of attributed fault and name the actual source of the intelligence compromise. The language would be bureaucratic. The revision would appear in a file that was classified and that most people would never read. None of that mattered to her in a documentary sense. What mattered was that it would exist, that the record would be corrected, that David Renner's daughter, who was now 11 years old and had never been told why her father died, would at least exist in a world where the official version of events was the true one. That was enough. 2 days after her return, the base held its standard morning formation. Emily stood in the second rank, in her position, in the desert heat that was already building to its daily peak. Major Voss read the operational summary. He said nothing special. He made no announcements about the previous week. He had spoken to her privately and said what needed to be said, and that was the transaction that mattered. The rest, the formal record, the amended reports, the chain of communications that would eventually reach people who had never been to this desert and would never meet her, was already in motion and required nothing more from her. After formation, Kruger found her at the rifle range. He had come alone, which was either accidental or deliberate, and she suspected it was deliberate that he had walked down to the range in the early morning for exactly this purpose, and that the calculation had cost him something. There is a specific kind of cost to admitting you were wrong when you were loudly wrong, when you were wrong in front of people, when your wrongness was not a private mistake but a performance. He stood beside her for a moment, looking downrange. The range in the morning was empty and quiet, the targets small orange squares at their measured distances, the desert beyond them stretching out in the particular horizontal endlessness of this country. Then he said, "I've been in this unit 6 years." She said nothing. "I've been the best shooter here the entire time." Still nothing. Not coldness, just the absence of a lie. She did not need to contradict him or confirm him. He was finding his way to what he had come to say, and the fastest path was to let him find it without obstruction. "I'm not apologizing for what I said. I mean," he stopped, started again. "I'm apologizing for what I said." She looked at him sidelong. He was not comfortable with this. His jaw was set, and his eyes stayed downrange, and everything about his posture communicated the effort of a man doing something his body would prefer not to do. He was doing it anyway, which was the relevant fact. "You didn't flinch," he said, "the whole week. Not once." "No." "Why not? Some of the things said were—" "I know what was said." He waited. "Because flinching costs energy," she said, "and I needed the energy for other things." He turned this over. She could see him processing it not skeptically, but with the genuine attention of someone receiving information that reorients a prior understanding. He had operated for 6 years on the assumption that dominance required response, that silence was weakness, that a person who did not defend themselves was either incapable of defense or afraid. She had provided 6 days of evidence for a different interpretation. "Renner was yours," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes. I'm sorry." She looked downrange. The distance markers were bright in the morning sun, 200, 400, 600, 800. The numbers painted on small orange signs that had faded to a dusty pink from years of desert exposure. The 800 meter marker was slightly tilted, wind pushed over time, leaning a few degrees left. She had been noting it since her first day. It did not affect her shooting. It was just a thing she had noticed. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He stood there for another moment in the way of a man who has done the difficult thing and now does not quite know how to complete the transition out of the moment. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had simply filled itself with everything that had been said and could now exist without further expansion. Then he left. She stayed at the range alone for a while, not shooting, just standing with the rifle case at her feet and the desert opening up to the horizon in every direction, flat and ancient and indifferent in the good way, the way that reminds you that the world existed before your trouble and will exist after it, and that this is not a reason for despair but for proportion. Private First Class Wayne Donaldson came by later in the morning and stopped at a respectful distance. He was carrying 2 canteens and he held one out to her. She took it. "Heard what happened," he said, "with Bellamy. With the 2019 thing." "Some of it," she said. "Is it true? That they blamed you for?" "Yes." "And the actual?" "Yes." He absorbed this with the particular seriousness of someone who has recently learned that systems he had trusted to be reliable are reliable only sometimes, and only when no one in the system has reason for them not to be. It was an education that would take years to fully complete. He was beginning it now. "Does it make you angry?" he asked. She thought about it. Not the polite version of the question, "Does it make you angry?" to which the expected answer is measured and philosophical, but the actual version. Did it make her angry? Did 5 years of a corrected file that had not been corrected, of a name attached to a failure that was not her failure, of Renner's daughter growing up in a world where the official account was wrong, did that make her angry? "It made me accurate," she said. He didn't fully understand it. That was all right, he had time. At 1600, Major Voss called the unit to an informal assembly, not a formation, just a gathering in the common area outside the ops building. He said he had an announcement. He stood on the steps with his clipboard and his reading glasses and the particular authority of a man who has been in the military long enough to know that the ceremony around a thing is not the same as the thing, and that sometimes the ceremony matters anyway. He read a commendation. Emily Carter's name, the mission, the outcome. The counterintelligence component described in terms sufficiently general to satisfy classification requirements and sufficiently specific that every person standing in that sun understood exactly what had been accomplished and what had been prevented. When he finished, he looked up. The unit was standing in the desert sun, and the silence that followed the reading had a different quality from any silence that had come before, not the silence of 30 people not knowing what to say, but the silence of 30 people choosing not to interrupt something. The kind of silence that is itself a form of acknowledgement, more complete in its way than any word. Voss said, "Dismissed." Emily walked back toward the barracks. The unit parted to let her through. No one said "sweetheart." She reached the door of the barracks and paused for a moment, hand on the handle. Behind her, she could hear the unit dispersing boots on gravel, low conversation, the normal sounds of a normal day resuming. She could hear Donaldson saying something to someone in a low voice. She could hear the desert wind picking up along the southern perimeter, the same wind that had been running across this ground for 1,000 years before any of them arrived, and would run across it for 1,000 years after they were gone. She pushed open the door and went inside. She did not look back. Not because she was making a point, not because she was cold, or hard, or unaffected by the weight of 5 years and one corrected file and one man's genuine apology on a rifle range in the morning sun, but because what she had come here to do was done. The account was settled, the record was clean. And whatever came next, the next mission, the next base, the next room full of people who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth, she would meet it the same way she had met this one. Quietly, accurately, with nothing to prove and everything already known. The rifle case sat in the corner of her bunk room that night, latched, zeroed, and ready. She had cleaned the weapon before sleeping, not because it required cleaning after what amounted to 5 shots in a single engagement, but because the discipline of maintenance was not contingent on necessity. You maintained the instrument whether or not the instrument had been stressed. That was the principle. The principle did not change based on how you felt or how tired you were or whether the night had been long. She lay on the bunk with one arm behind her head and listened to the bass settle into its night rhythms. Somewhere on the far side of the compound, a generator cycled through its standard maintenance sequence. A door closed. Wind moved along the exterior wall of the barracks with a low, continuous sound. She thought about Renner's daughter, 11 years old, somewhere in Ohio, in a house where a photograph of a man in uniform occupied a specific shelf and was dusted on a specific day of the week. She would not know, not yet, that the file had been amended. She might not know for years. But the amendment existed. It was real. Whatever she eventually came to understand about the circumstances of her father's death, she would understand it from a record that was true. That was the work. That was what accurate meant. In the end, not the velocity and the windage and the 1,000-meter shot in desert heat, but this. The record corrected, the truth placed where the lie had been, the account of a man's death made to correspond with the facts of his death. Outside, FOB Kestrel held its positions against the desert dark. The stars over the Mojave were indifferent and brilliant and very old. The wind changed direction twice between midnight and dawn, the way it always did, the way anyone paying attention would have anticipated. She was already asleep.